A police badge lies in a pool of blood, its golden surface reflecting two bodies on an apartment floor. His last text to his wife reads, "I'm sorry." But sorry wasn't enough for Detective James Crawford, and the woman who loved him wasn't the only one who paid the price. Some secrets are better left buried. Others refuse to die quietly in the Texas heat. The summer of 2003 draped itself over Austin like a heavy blanket, the kind of heat that made even the most hardened Texans seek refuge in air-conditioned sanctuaries. Detective James Crawford stood at his bedroom window, adjusting his tie with practiced precision as he watched the sun creep above the manicured lawns of Circle C Ranch, an upper-middle-class suburb that had become home to many of Austin's finest. At 43, Crawford cut an impressive figure, 6 feet of disciplined muscle topped with prematurely graying hair that seemed to lend gravitas to his already commanding presence. Behind him, Lily Crawford moved through their morning routine with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 15 years choreographing her life around a police officer's schedule. At 41, she maintained the same elegant beauty that had caught James's eye at the police department's annual Christmas party back in '88, when she was still Lily Mitchell, a promising young prosecutor with the district attorney's office. Now, she juggled her part-time legal consulting work with raising their 2 teenagers, Michael and Emma, aged 16 and 14 respectively. "Dad, can I get a ride to practice?" Michael's voice carried up the stairs, followed by the familiar thud of his baseball bag hitting the floor. James checked his watch, a Tudor Black Bay, a gift from Lily on their 15th anniversary just 6 months ago. The inscription on the back read, "To time stood still with you. Love, Lily. Ask your mother, Mike. I've got the Daniel briefing at 8. James's voice carried the weight of authority, even in these domestic moments. It was the same tone that had served him well through 15 years with the Austin Police Department, through promotions and commendations, through cases that had made headlines and others that had kept him awake at night. Lily appeared in the doorway, car keys already in hand. "I'll take him. Emma has student council anyway." She paused, studying her husband's reflection in the mirror. "Will you be home for dinner? The Reeves invited us over." "Should be. Unless this Daniel case breaks." He turned, offering her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The Daniel case, a series of home invasions in West Austin, was just the latest in a string of high-profile investigations that had landed on his desk. Since 9/11, the public's respect for law enforcement had reached new heights, and with it came increased pressure to maintain that sterling image. Across town, in the modest Holly Street neighborhood of East Austin, Destiny Williams was already 2 hours into her day. At 35, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned early that the world rarely gave you anything you didn't fight for. The pre-dawn light filtered through the worn blinds of her small apartment as she packed a lunch for her daughter, Shayla, turkey sandwich, apple slices, and a note with a drawn heart that read, "Reach for the stars, baby girl." Destiny's uniform for her job as an administrative assistant at St. David's Medical Center hung pressed and ready on the bathroom door. It was the first of 2 jobs she would work today, the second being evening shifts at a local pharmacy. The constant juggle of schedules, the careful budgeting of every dollar, the endless stream of babysitters. This had been her life since Shayla's father had walked out 8 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a string of broken promises and unpaid child support. "Mama, Ms. Rodriguez says I need new shoes for dance class." Shayla's voice drifted from the small bedroom they shared, where the 8-year-old was struggling with her cornrows. Destiny felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the constant mathematics of single motherhood, calculating which bill could be delayed, which expense could be trimmed. "We'll figure it out, baby. Come here. Let me fix those braids." Destiny's fingers moved with practiced care through her daughter's hair, the same way her own mother had done for her, back in the projects of Houston where she'd grown up. She'd fought hard to give Shayla something better, a decent school, a safe neighborhood, even if it meant working herself to exhaustion. The contrast between the Crawfords and Williams mornings painted a stark picture of Austin in 2003, a city wrestling with rapid growth and changing demographics. While the tech boom had brought prosperity to many, it had also deepened the divide between communities. West Austin continued to grow more affluent, while East Austin, historically home to the city's Black and Hispanic populations, fought against the early waves of gentrification. James Crawford's rise through the police ranks had coincided with this transformation of Austin. Born to a middle-class family in San Antonio, he'd worked his way through the police academy with single-minded determination. His colleagues knew him as meticulous, ambitious, and unfailingly professional. New recruits sought his mentorship, superior officers marked him for advancement, and even the most hardened criminals seemed to respect the quiet authority he carried. Detective Crawford's the real deal, Officer Martinez would later tell internal affairs investigators. The kind of cop who'd give you the shirt off his back, then write you up the next day if you violated protocol. By the book, all the way. That reputation had been built case by case, arrest by arrest. The drug bust that had taken down 3 corrupt officers in '97. The child trafficking ring he'd helped dismantle in 2000. The serial arson case that had earned him a commendation from the mayor just last year. Each success had added another layer to the armor of respectability he wore as naturally as his badge. Lily had been there through it all, playing her part as the dedicated police wife. She'd held him through the nightmares after the Williams child murder case in '96, hosted countless department functions, and learned to sleep through the late-night phone calls that could send him rushing out into the darkness. Their marriage had become a model for younger officers, proof that you could serve the badge and still maintain a family. Their children had grown up in the protective bubble of law enforcement privilege. Michael, with his father's build and his mother's quick mind, was already talking about the academy after college. Emma, sharp-tongued and perceptive, had inherited her father's sense of justice and her mother's legal aptitude. They attended good schools, played the right sports, and moved in circles where their father's profession carried respect rather than suspicion. Destiny Williams inhabited a different Austin entirely. Her world was one of careful calculations and constant vigilance. The hospital where she worked primary reception was just a few blocks from police headquarters, a gleaming testament to Austin's prosperity. She'd earned her position through night classes at Austin Community College, studying medical terminology and office management while her mother watched Shayla. "You're too smart for this place," her supervisor, Dr. Patel, often told her. "You should be running the whole department." But advancement required time. Time for more classes, more certifications, more networking. Time was the one luxury single motherhood didn't afford. Instead, Destiny poured her ambitions into Shayla, making sure her daughter's world extended beyond the boundaries others might try to impose. Dance classes, science camps, private tutoring when math proved challenging, each opportunity purchased with extra shifts and careful budgeting. Shayla was already showing signs of her mother's determination, bringing home principals' list certificates and beaming through dance recitals. These two worlds, Crawford's and Williams', existed in parallel, separated by invisible but rigid lines of class, race, and opportunity. In 2003 Austin, such lines were simultaneously blurring and deepening. Tech money was pushing property values sky-high, forcing longtime East Austin residents from their homes. New restaurants and boutiques appeared on streets that had once housed family businesses passed down through generations. The police department stood at the intersection of these changing dynamics. Post-9/11 America had granted law enforcement unprecedented authority and respect, but with it came increased scrutiny of how that authority was wielded. Community relations, particularly with minority neighborhoods, remained a delicate balance of enforcement and engagement. It was into this complex landscape that fate would soon draw James Crawford and Destiny Williams, their lives intersecting in room 210 of the Austin Police Department's Complaint Division. But on this morning, as summer tightened its grip on the city, they were still simply players being moved into position. Pieces on a board neither of them yet knew they were playing. Neither could have guessed that in 6 months' time, his badge would lie in a pool of blood on her apartment floor, their story becoming yet another chapter in Austin's ongoing narrative of power, race, and the price of crossing lines that perhaps should have remained uncrossed. Room 210 of the Austin Police Department had seen its share of broken spirits and shattered lives, but something about Destiny Williams made Detective James Crawford pause longer than usual at the doorway. Perhaps it was the way she sat, spine straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, head held high despite the slight tremor in her voice as she recounted the past 3 months of escalating harassment at St. David's Medical Center. He started small, she explained, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of the complaint form. Comments about my hair, my dress. Then it was touches that lasted too long. Last week, he cornered me in the supply room. Her voice didn't break, but Crawford noticed the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her knuckles whitened against the paper. It wasn't his case. Shouldn't have been his case. Workplace harassment complaints typically went to the Special Victims Unit. But something in her composure, that dignity under pressure, made him linger. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, already pulling up a chair. The metal legs scraped against linoleum, the sound harsh in the fluorescent-lit room. Dr. Marcus Daniel, Destiny continued, the name bitter on her tongue. Chief of Emergency Medicine. He's made it clear that complaints would be unwise. The implication hung heavy in the air. A black single mother against a prominent white physician. In 2003 Austin, such battles were rarely won. Crawford found himself leaning forward, his practiced detective's neutrality slipping just enough to show genuine concern. "Ms. Williams, what you're describing isn't just harassment. It's assault." His voice carried the weight of 15 years of authority, but there was something else there too. A personal investment that would later raise eyebrows during the internal investigation. That first meeting stretched from its scheduled 30 minutes to nearly 2 hours. Crawford learned about Shayla, about Destiny's second job at the pharmacy, about her dreams of becoming a hospital administrator. Destiny, in turn, found herself drawn to the quiet intensity with which he listened, the way he seemed to catch every nuance of her story. "I'll handle this personally," he promised as she stood to leave. Their hands met briefly as he passed her his card. A touch that should have been professional but somehow wasn't. "Call me directly if anything else happens. Day or night." Lily Crawford noticed the change in her husband that evening, though she couldn't have named it then. He was distracted during dinner, checking his phone more frequently than usual. When Emma mentioned problems with a boy at school, James launched into an unexpectedly passionate speech about standing up to intimidation. "Haven't seen you this fired up about a case in a while," Lily commented as they got ready for bed. She watched him in the bathroom mirror, looking for clues in his reflection. "What makes this one different?" "Some people think a title gives them the right to do whatever they want," he replied, avoiding her eyes. "Sometimes they need to be reminded that no one's above the law." The investigation moved with unusual speed. Crawford interviewed hospital staff, gathered security footage, built a case methodically but with an urgency that had his partner, Detective Martinez, raising an eyebrow. "Since when do you handle harassment cases, man?" Martinez asked over coffee. "That's not even our department." But Crawford was already pulling strings, calling in favors. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Daniel was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The hospital's board of directors, eager to avoid scandal, quietly arranged for his resignation. Destiny Williams found herself suddenly promoted to senior administrative coordinator, complete with a corner office and a significant raise. The victory should have marked the end of their professional relationship. Instead, it became the foundation for something more dangerous. Crawford began finding reasons to follow up, additional statements needed, clarifications of previous testimony. Each meeting lasted longer than necessary, their conversations drifting from the case to more personal territories. Destiny felt it too, the growing anticipation before each meeting, the way her skin seemed more alive when he was near. She told herself it was gratitude, respect for a man who had taken her seriously when so many others hadn't. But late at night, after Shayla was asleep, she found herself replaying their conversations, analyzing every word, every glance. Their worlds began to intersect in small but significant ways. Crawford started taking lunch breaks at the hospital cafeteria, claiming it was convenient to his patrol route. Destiny found herself volunteering for hospital liaison duties with the police department. Each encounter was professional on the surface, but charged with an undercurrent of growing attraction that neither could fully deny. Shayla was the first to voice what others would soon suspect. "Officer Crawford looks at you like Daddy used to look at his new wife," she observed innocently after Crawford had stopped by their apartment to follow up on some paperwork. The comment hit Destiny like a physical blow, forcing her to confront feelings she'd been trying to ignore. The community wasn't blind to these developments. East Austin's grapevine hummed with speculation about the white detective who seemed to have taken such an interest in Destiny Williams' case. Some saw it as progress, proof that the system could work for them too. Others, particularly those who remembered darker chapters of Austin's racial history, warned of danger. "Baby girl, men with badges are trouble twice over," Destiny's mother warned during one of her Sunday visits. "And married ones." She shook her head, wisdom born from decades of watching similar stories end in tears. "That's playing with fire." Lily Crawford's instincts were sharper than her husband anticipated. She noticed the subtle changes, the extra care he took with his appearance, the way he jumped slightly when his phone buzzed, the distracted looks during family dinners. One evening, helping him sort laundry, she found a receipt from the hospital cafeteria in his pocket. It was dated on a Saturday, a day he'd claimed to be working a stakeout downtown. "The Daniel case was resolved weeks ago," she mentioned casually over breakfast, watching his reaction. "Yet you still seem to have a lot of follow-up work at St. David's." James's pause was almost imperceptible, but to a woman who had spent 15 years reading his moods, it spoke volumes. "Complex cases have loose ends," he replied, suddenly very interested in his coffee. "We have to be thorough." The power dynamics at play were as complex as they were volatile. Crawford, despite his genuine desire to help, couldn't fully escape the privilege his position afforded him. Each time he pulled into the visitors' parking at St. David's, each time he flashed his badge to bypass security and head straight to Destiny's office, he was unconsciously wielding authority that went beyond his official role. Destiny, for her part, found herself walking an increasingly precarious line. The promotion had brought new responsibilities, new respect within the hospital hierarchy. But whispers followed her through the corridors, suggestions that her rise had more to do with Detective Crawford's interest than her own merits. By the end of summer, the situation had evolved into something neither of them had planned for, but both seemed powerless to stop. Their professional meetings had developed an intimacy that went beyond the bounds of propriety. Simple case discussions became lengthy conversations about their lives, their dreams, their disappointments. "I never thought I'd find someone who really sees me," Destiny confided during one such meeting, the words escaping before she could catch them. The look that passed between them then was charged with everything they hadn't said, everything they couldn't say. Crawford's response was to reach across his desk and take her hand, a gesture that would be replayed countless times in the subsequent investigation. In that moment, both of them knew they had crossed a line, one of many they would cross in the months to come. The stage was set, the players positioned, and the first domino of their tragedy had begun to fall. In the heart of Texas, where summer heat made even the most level-headed people do crazy things, a decorated detective and a determined single mother were about to learn that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The first kiss happened in the shadows of the hospital parking garage, Level B2, where security cameras had been temporarily out of order for weeks. Detective James Crawford had followed Destiny to her car after another late-night case review, his heart hammering against his badge with an intensity that drowned out 15 years of wedding vows. The Texas heat turned the concrete structure into an oven, but neither noticed the sweat beading on their skin as years of professional restraint finally shattered. "We can't," Destiny whispered, even as her fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. The security light above them flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance around their guilt. "I know," Crawford responded, but his hands were already framing her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones with a tenderness that made her knees weak. When their lips met, it wasn't the tentative exploration of a first kiss. It was drowning people finally gasping for air. That kiss became a point of no return, a moment both would replay in their minds during sleepless nights to come. For Crawford, it marked the first deliberate step away from the carefully constructed life he'd built. For Destiny, it was a plunge into waters she knew were too deep, too dangerous, but somehow couldn't resist. Their first real meeting beyond the confines of work came 3 days later. Crawford told Lily he was working a surveillance detail. Destiny asked her mother to watch Shayla, claiming a hospital fundraising event. They met at the Lake Travis Inn, a discreet establishment 40 minutes outside Austin where the staff didn't ask questions and the rooms were paid for in cash. "I've never done anything like this," Destiny confessed as Crawford drew the curtains. The room was modest but clean, anonymous in its generic decor. I always swore I'd never be the other woman, Crawford finished, turning to face her. In the dim light, his badge and ring lay side by side on the nightstand, twin symbols of the trust he was betraying. We can stop this now. Walk away. But they both knew they wouldn't. When he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, the last threads of resistance snapped. Their coming together was fierce, desperate, as if they could erase the wrongness of their actions through the sheer intensity of their passion. The pattern established itself with frightening speed. Burner phones purchased with cash. Meetings choreographed around work schedules and family commitments. Crawford became an expert in crafting plausible excuses, stakeouts, confidential informant meetings, department training sessions. Each lie came easier than the last. Lily began finding more receipts from unfamiliar places, noting the growing frequency of late-night calls that took her husband from their bed. Another CI meeting, she asked one night, her voice carefully neutral as Crawford dressed at 2 a.m. The question hung between them like smoke. Breakthrough in the Martinez case, he replied smoothly, not meeting her eyes. He'd started keeping case files on his desk at home, props in an elaborate performance. Could be the lead we've been waiting for. Destiny's guilt manifested differently. Every Sunday at church, she felt the weight of judgment from a God who surely saw through her rationalizations. When Shayla spoke admiringly of Officer Crawford, each word was a knife in her heart. He's like the daddy in my friend Katie's family, Shayla said one evening. He protects people. The secret took its toll in unexpected ways. Crawford became short-tempered at work, snapping at junior officers over minor infractions. His partner, Martinez, noticed him becoming increasingly protective of his phone, angling the screen away during conversations. Everything okay at home? Martinez ventured one afternoon as they sat in their unmarked car, watching a suspected drug house. Lily mentioned you've been distant lately. Crawford's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Just focused on work. You know how it gets. But work was suffering too. Reports came in late. Leads went unfollowed. Crawford's superiors, who had always praised his meticulous attention to detail, began noting inconsistencies in his paperwork. For Destiny, the strain showed in moments of jarring contrast. She'd be floating on the high of a passionate encounter with Crawford, only to return home and find Shayla working on a My Family project for school. The sight of her daughter carefully drawing a blank space where a father should be would bring waves of shame so intense they left her gasping. Their meetings grew more frequent, more reckless. They began taking chances, a quiet restaurant in South Austin where Crawford knew the owner, a secluded spot in Kinney Falls State Park. Each encounter deepened their emotional entanglement while fraying the threads of their separate lives. I think about leaving her, Crawford whispered one night as they lay tangled in hotel sheets. The words hung in the darkness like a dangerous promise. Starting fresh. Just you, me, and Shayla. Destiny's heart leaped even as her mind screamed warnings. You don't mean that. You have children, a career. I've never felt this alive, he interrupted, pulling her closer. With you, I'm not just the badge or the husband or the father. I'm just me. But reality had a way of shattering such moments. One evening, rushing to meet Crawford, Destiny nearly collided with Lily at the grocery store. Their carts met with a metallic clash that seemed to echo the collision of their worlds. Mrs. Crawford, Destiny managed, her voice surprisingly steady despite the thunder of her heart. I haven't seen you since the department fundraiser. Lily's smile was polite but her eyes were sharp, taking in Destiny's carefully applied makeup, the hint of perfume. How's the follow-up on your case going? James mentions he still consults with you occasionally. The word occasionally carried weight, and Destiny felt heat rise in her cheeks. Detective Crawford has been very thorough. The encounter shook both lovers, but instead of causing them to pull back, it seemed to fuel their passion. The danger of discovery became its own aphrodisiac, adding a razor's edge of excitement to each stolen moment. Their carelessness grew. Crawford began leaving his wedding ring in his desk drawer during their meetings. Destiny started wearing the perfume he bought her even on days they weren't supposed to meet. They took to meeting in her office after hours, the risk of discovery adding a dangerous thrill to their encounters. The affair began bleeding into their families' lives in subtle ways. Crawford missed his son's baseball game for the first time in years, claiming a work emergency when he was really with Destiny. He forgot his wedding anniversary, something that had never happened in 15 years of marriage. Destiny's daughter Shayla began asking questions that cut too close to the bone. "Why does Officer Crawford come to see you so much, Mama? Is something bad happening?" The lies piled up like dead leaves in autumn, covering the ground between what was and what should have been. Crawford told Lily he was working special assignments when he was really in Destiny's arms. Destiny told her mother she was taking night classes when she was meeting Crawford in anonymous hotel rooms. Their worlds began to blur dangerously. Crawford started dropping by the hospital even when there was no pretense of official business. Destiny found herself driving past his house late at night, just to feel closer to him. They exchanged texts constantly, their burner phones becoming lifelines to a shared secret world. The impact on the police department became impossible to ignore. Officers who had once sought Crawford's mentorship began avoiding him, sensing something off in his demeanor. The chief of detectives called him in for a closed-door meeting about his declining case closure rate. "Whatever's going on, handle it," the chief advised, his tone making it clear he didn't want to know the details. "You're too good a detective to throw it all away." But Crawford wasn't listening. He was thinking about Destiny, about the way she looked at him like he was more than his badge, more than his failures. The affair had become his oxygen, and he was willing to burn everything else for one more breath. Behind closed doors, their passion took on an almost desperate quality. Each meeting could be their last. Each touch had to be memorable enough to sustain them through the hours or days until they could meet again. They made love like people trying to leave marks on each other's souls, knowing their time was borrowed. "Sometimes I think God brought us together to punish me," Destiny confessed one afternoon as they lay in the afterglow of their passion. "For wanting more than I should, for not being content with what I have." Crawford traced patterns on her bare shoulder, his touch gentle but possessive. "Or maybe to save us both." But salvation wasn't in the cards for either of them. As autumn crept toward winter, their careful facades began to crack. Crawford started sleeping in his home office, claiming insomnia. Lily found herself checking his phone bills, noting calls to numbers that didn't exist in his contacts. Destiny's daughter began having trouble at school, her grades slipping as she sensed the growing tension in her mother's life. The guilt began eating at both lovers like acid, corroding their joy even as it failed to diminish their need for each other. Yet they couldn't stop. The affair had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond their control like a wildfire in the Texas brush. Each time they swore it would be the last time. Each time they promised themselves they would end it. The need would return stronger than ever. Neither of them could have known then that their passion would end in blood and gunshots, that their secret would eventually lie exposed under harsh fluorescent lights and crime scene tape. In that moment, tangled in each other's arms, they were simply two people drowning in a love that had become too dangerous to sustain but too precious to surrender. Captain Rodriguez stared at the manila envelope on his desk, its contents scattered across the polished wood like accusations. The photos were grainy but unmistakable. Detective James Crawford and Destiny Williams emerging from the Lake Travis Inn on 3 separate occasions, their body language telling a story that no amount of explanation could justify. The anonymous note accompanying them was brief but damning. "Your decorated detective is sleeping with a witness. Check his case files." The weight of 15 years of friendship with Crawford pressed against Rodriguez's chest as he reached for his intercom. Some decisions came with the badge, regardless of personal cost. "Get me internal affairs," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Now." The investigation began quietly, like most storms in Texas. A few subtle questions here, a review of case files there. Crawford noticed the change in his colleagues first. Conversations that died when he entered the break room. Younger officers who no longer sought his mentorship. Partners who suddenly had other plans for lunch. The thin blue line that had once protected him now seemed to be drawing itself around him, creating a barrier between the decorated detective and those he'd once called brothers. His partner, Martinez, was the first to break the silence during a long stakeout, the darkness of the car providing a shield for difficult truths. Internal Affairs was asking about your harassment case files, he said, eyes fixed straight ahead. About Ms. Williams specifically. The words hung in the stale air between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. At home, Lily Crawford stood in her pristine kitchen, holding the evidence of her husband's betrayal. A backup phone she'd found buried in his gym bag. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through messages that stripped away 15 years of trust, each one a knife twisting deeper into her heart. The timestamps matched perfectly with nights when James had claimed to be working late. Nights when she'd lain awake listening to his increasingly hollow excuses about surveillance operations and confidential informants. The pressure built in both households like a gathering storm. Lily began attending extra legal consultation sessions, building a network that Crawford recognized as preparation for divorce. Their children, once proud of their father's badge, began to withdraw. Michael stopped asking about the police academy, his childhood dream of following in his father's footsteps tarnished by whispered rumors and overheard phone calls. Emma found reasons to stay at friends' houses, avoiding the suffocating tension that had replaced family dinners and movie nights. At St. David's Medical Center, Destiny's world was crumbling under different but equally devastating pressure. Whispers followed her through the corridors, her recent promotion now tainted by speculation. She caught fragments of conversations that died when she approached, saw the judgment in her colleagues' eyes. The hospital administration called her in for a meeting where words like professional conduct and public image floated around the conference room like vultures circling a dying animal. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Shayla came home from school in tears. "Tommy said you're a homewrecker," she sobbed into her mother's arms. "His mom says you're breaking up Officer Crawford's family." The words hit Destiny like physical blows, forcing her to confront the ripple effects of their affair on the most innocent victims, their children. Crawford and Destiny tried to end it. They met at their usual spot by the lake, the November wind whipping across the water as they sat in his car, the space between them charged with everything they couldn't say. "They're investigating me," Crawford finally admitted, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Internal Affairs has photos. Their attempts at separation were like trying to stop a hurricane with wishes. 3 days after swearing it was over, Crawford showed up at her apartment at midnight, still in his uniform, the desperation in his eyes matching the tremor in his voice. "I can't do it," he confessed as she opened the door. "I can't pretend you don't matter." Their reconciliation was brief and explosive, leaving them more entangled than ever. The department placed Crawford on administrative leave pending the Internal Affairs investigation. His badge and gun were taken temporarily, leaving him feeling stripped not just of his authority but of his identity. He started drinking, just a finger of whiskey at first, then the whole bottle. Hours spent sitting in his car outside Destiny's apartment, watching her windows, unable to stay away despite knowing each visit dug their hole deeper. Lily changed the locks on their house, forcing Crawford to collect his clothes from the front lawn while their children watched from upstairs windows. "Until you decide what you want," she told him through the door, her voice carrying years of accumulated pain and betrayal. The investigation expanded like an oil spill, contaminating everything it touched. Old cases were reopened, looking for signs of favoritism or misconduct. Crawford's colleagues, once loyal friends, began distancing themselves, afraid of being tainted by association. His lawyer warned him repeatedly that he was committing professional suicide, that 20 years of service and his pension would vanish, but Crawford seemed beyond caring. Destiny tried dating other men, a pharmaceutical rep who asked her to dinner, an IT technician who fixed her computer. But each attempt felt hollow, a pale imitation of what she'd found with Crawford. The intensity of their connection had ruined her for normal relationships, leaving her caught between the impossibility of going forward and the inability to go back. Their attempts to stay apart grew shorter each time. A week, 3 days, 24 hours. Each reunion was more desperate than the last, tinged with the knowledge that they were watching their lives unravel and seemed powerless to stop it. Crawford moved into an extended-stay motel on the outskirts of town, the walls thin and the air conditioning temperamental, but close to Destiny's apartment. He started missing mandatory counseling sessions, showing up late to Internal Affairs interviews. The pressure continued to mount from all sides. Anonymous calls to the hospital board questioned Destiny's qualifications. Shayla's teacher requested a parent-teacher conference to discuss her declining focus and concerning drawings. Lily's lawyer sent increasingly aggressive letters about division of assets and custody arrangements. The thin blue line that had once protected Crawford began to feel more like a noose. One night, driving back from another failed attempt to end things, Crawford nearly hit a pedestrian. His blood alcohol level wasn't tested, his old colleagues still protecting him out of lingering loyalty, but the incident shook him to his core. "We're going to destroy everything," he told Destiny the next day in her office. "Our careers, our families, everything we've built." "I know," she replied, but her hands were already pulling him closer. "But I don't know how to stop." The walls were closing in, the pressure building to unbearable levels. Like water wearing away at a dam, each new pressure point weakened their resistance until collapse became inevitable. Their tragedy wasn't in the breaking, but in their stubborn refusal to see that some things, once broken, can never be repaired. Neither of them could have guessed then just how devastating that break would be, or that their inability to end their affair would lead to the ultimate destruction, not just of their careers or families, but of life itself. Lily Crawford had imagined this moment 100 times, but nothing prepared her for the reality of finding the hotel receipts stuffed in the pocket of James's dress uniform as she prepared it for dry cleaning. Lake Travis Inn, room 214, charged to their joint credit card, no longer even trying to hide it. Her hands shook as she dug deeper into the pocket, finding a folded note in unfamiliar handwriting. "Last night was worth any consequence. All my love, D." The careful facade she'd maintained for months shattered. Images of James and Destiny flooded her mind, their touches, their whispered promises, their betrayal now documented in her trembling hands. The sound that escaped her throat was primal, a wounded animal's cry that brought their daughter Emma running from her room. "Mom? What's wrong?" Emma stood in the doorway, her 16-year-old face a mirror of Lily's younger self. The sight of her daughter snapped something in Lily's chest. "Call your father," she said, her voice steel-edged. "Tell him to come home. Now." James Crawford arrived 30 minutes later, his unmarked police car pulling into the driveway just as Michael was leaving with Emma. One look at his children's faces told him everything he needed to know. This was the moment he'd been dreading, the collision of his two worlds that could no longer be avoided. Lily waited in the kitchen, the receipts and note laid out on the granite counter like evidence at a crime scene. 15 years, she said as he entered, not turning to face him. 15 years of marriage, and you couldn't even keep it off our credit card. "Lily, I don't." She spun to face him, and the fury in her eyes made him step back. "Don't you dare try to explain. Don't you dare stand there in that uniform and lie to me again." She picked up the note, crumpling it in her fist. "Does she make you feel young again, James? Does she make you forget what you're throwing away?" The confrontation escalated quickly. Years of buried resentment erupted as Lily hurled accusations and James's protests grew increasingly desperate. When she threatened to report him to internal affairs herself, something dark flickered across his face, a glimpse of violence that made her instinctively step back. "You wouldn't dare," he growled, his hand unconsciously moving to where his service weapon would normally rest. The gesture, though incomplete, hung between them like a thundercloud. "Get out," Lily whispered, then louder. "Get out before I forget you're my children's father." Across town, Destiny Williams was facing her own moment of truth. Her mother had staged an intervention with their pastor, sitting in Destiny's small living room while Shayla was at school. "This man is destroying everything you've built," her mother pleaded. "Look at what it's doing to Shayla. Look at what it's doing to you." Pastor Matthews leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Sister Williams, we've known each other since you were a child. This isn't you, sneaking around, breaking up a family. What example are you setting for your daughter?" The words cut deep because they echoed her own doubts. That morning, she'd found Shayla crying over a family photo project, unable to complete it because her classmates had been teasing her about her mother's relationship with that married cop. When Crawford showed up at her apartment that evening, unannounced and smelling of whiskey, Destiny met him at the door with resolve hardened by guilt and maternal instinct. "We have to end this," she said, blocking his entry. "For real this time. No more one last time, no more excuses." Crawford's response chilled her. "I've already lost everything else," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not losing you too." The warning signs were there for anyone paying attention. Crawford's behavior at the precinct had become increasingly erratic during his administrative leave. He'd shown up drunk to his internal affairs interview, ranting about conspiracies and betrayal. His partner Martinez had tried to intervene, inviting him to dinner, offering to help him find counseling. "You're scaring people, man," Martinez had said during their last conversation. "This isn't you. Let us help." But Crawford was beyond help. The loss of his badge, his family, and now potentially destiny had pushed him to the edge of sanity. He spent nights parked outside her apartment, watching shadows move behind curtains, imagining her with someone else. The whiskey bottle became his constant companion, fueling paranoid fantasies of betrayal and revenge. His colleagues saw the signs but underestimated their severity. They'd seen good cops go through rough patches before: divorce, drinking, depression. But something darker was brewing in Crawford's mind, something that made even hardened veterans uncomfortable. Lieutenant Rodriguez made one final attempt to reach him, meeting Crawford at their old hangout, a dive bar on East 6th Street. "James, brother, you're not just burning bridges anymore. You're rigging them with explosives. Take the suspension. Get help. Rebuild." Crawford's response was chilling. "Some things can't be rebuilt, capital. Some things can only burn." The final catalyst came on a humid December evening. Crawford, drunk and desperate, followed Destiny from the hospital to a small French restaurant downtown. Through the window, he watched her meet with a lawyer, the same lawyer who had handled her harassment case against Dr. Daniel. His alcohol-soaked mind twisted the scene into something sinister. In his distorted reality, she wasn't seeking legal advice. She was betraying him, preparing to testify against him, plotting to destroy what little he had left. He waited in his car until she left the restaurant, then followed her home. The weight of his backup weapon, stored in his glove compartment since his suspension, seemed to call to him. In his mind, the pieces of a twisted logic began to fall into place. If he couldn't have her, if she was going to betray him like everyone else had, then maybe it was time for everything to end. The thought should have horrified him, but instead, it brought a strange sense of peace. That night, he made 3 phone calls. First to Lily, leaving a rambling voicemail about regret and forgiveness. Then to his partner Martinez, thanking him for years of friendship. Finally to his lawyer, instructing him to ensure his pension went to his children. The calls raised immediate red flags. Martinez tried calling him back repeatedly, then contacted Rodriguez. Lily, despite her anger, felt a chill of fear at the tone of his message. But by the time anyone realized the full implications of Crawford's state of mind, he was already parked outside Destiny's apartment, the backup weapon loaded and resting on the passenger seat. In the gathering darkness, as thunder rumbled in the distance and the first drops of rain began to fall, Detective James Crawford stepped out of his car and walked toward the building, his decisions made, his path set. Behind him, his phone lit up with desperate calls from colleagues and family, all trying to prevent what they suddenly feared was coming. But some tragedies, once set in motion, cannot be stopped. Like a bullet leaving the chamber, there are moments that mark the point of no return. For James Crawford, for Destiny Williams, for everyone caught in their orbit, that point had arrived on a rainy Texas evening, wrapped in the false courage of whiskey and despair. The security camera in Destiny Williams' apartment complex captured Detective James Crawford's final approach at 9:47 p.m. His gait was steady despite the blood alcohol level that would later be recorded at twice the legal limit. The backup weapon, a Glock 27 he'd kept from his narcotics days, hung heavy in his jacket pocket. Thunder rolled across the Austin sky, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall as he punched in the gate code. Shayla's birthday, something he'd learned during happier times. Destiny was alone in the apartment, having sent Shayla to stay with her grandmother after the tension of recent days. The soft knock at her door didn't startle her. Some part of her had been expecting him. Through the peephole, she saw him standing there, shoulders slumped, his face cast in shadow. "James, go home," she called through the door. "We talked about this. It's over." "Just 5 minutes," he replied, his voice carrying that dangerous calm that seasoned officers learn to fear. "I need to say goodbye properly." Perhaps it was the word goodbye that made her open the door, or maybe the exhaustion of fighting what had become inevitable. The chain was still on when she cracked it open, but Crawford's shoulder made quick work of that final barrier. The neighbors would later report hearing raised voices, though none could make out the words. Mrs. Garcia in 3B would tell detectives she heard a woman cry out, "Please, don't," followed by what she thought was a car backfiring. Only when the second shot rang out did she realize what she was hearing and dial 911. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio at 10:13 p.m. "Shots fired, 1542 East Riverside, apartment 3C. Possible officer involved." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Squad cars converged from all directions, sirens piercing the rain-soaked night. Martinez, who had been trying to reach his partner for hours, was first on scene. The sight that greeted the responding officers would haunt them for years to come. Detective James Crawford, their decorated brother in blue, lay sprawled across Destiny Williams' living room floor, the Glock still clutched in his hand. Destiny's body was found in the kitchen, suggesting she had tried to run. A single shot to her back, another to Crawford's temple. The forensics would later confirm what everyone already knew, murder-suicide. On the coffee table, Crawford's phone displayed one final unsent text to Lily. "I'm sorry. I couldn't let her go. Tell the kids I loved them." Next to it lay Destiny's phone, open to a desperate message to her mother. "If anything happens to me, tell Shayla she was the best thing in my life." The news broke like wildfire across Austin's divided communities. Local stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news banners. Decorated APD detective kills African-American woman in murder-suicide. The racial component caught fire immediately, with social media exploding in heated debates about power, privilege, and police accountability. Lily Crawford learned of her husband's death from Lieutenant Rodriguez, who arrived at her door with the department chaplain. Her first words were for her children. Don't let them hear it on the news. But in the age of smartphones and instant notifications, Michael had already seen the headlines. His anguished cry from upstairs marked the moment their world shattered completely. Across town, Destiny's mother faced the impossible task of telling 8-year-old Shayla that her mother would never come home. The child's response, "Did Officer Crawford hurt my mama?" would be quoted in newspapers across the country, becoming a symbol of innocence destroyed by adult betrayal. The rain continued through the night as the crime scene technicians worked. Officers maintained a perimeter, their faces grim beneath clear plastic ponchos. The media gathered quickly, their camera lights creating an eerie glow in the mist. Local activist groups arrived soon after, their hastily made signs demanding justice for Destiny already running in the rain. By morning, the story had gone national. Cable news networks latched onto the narrative. White police officer, black victim, forbidden affair gone tragic. Pundits debated the broader implications: police accountability, racial dynamics, the thin blue line. Few focused on the personal tragedy, the destroyed families, the children left to make sense of adult failures. The Austin Police Department held its first press conference at 8 a.m. Chief Wilson, visibly shaken, addressed the gathered media. "Last night, we lost both a decorated officer and an innocent member of our community in a tragic act of violence. This is not what we stand for. This is not who we are." But for many in Austin's black community, it was exactly who they feared the police to be. Protests formed outside police headquarters, growing larger as the day progressed. Signs reading "Who polices the police?" and "Black Lives Matter" mingled with "Justice for Destiny" and "Protect Our Mothers." The racial tensions that had simmered beneath Austin's progressive surface boiled over. Community leaders pointed to the department's handling of Crawford's affair, arguing that a black officer involved with a white witness would have been suspended immediately. Others highlighted how Crawford's colleagues had protected him, enabled him, until it was too late. Inside the department, officers struggled with their own emotions. Crawford had been one of them, a brother in blue, yet his actions had betrayed everything they swore to protect. Martinez cleaned out his partner's desk himself, finding notes from Destiny mixed with case files and family photos. A life's complexity reduced to contents of a cardboard box. The children's trauma manifested in different ways. Michael Crawford withdrew completely, refusing to return to school where his father's actions made him a target for whispers and stares. Emma began acting out, her anger finding targets in everything her father had represented: authority, law enforcement, the system itself. Shayla Williams stopped speaking entirely for 3 months after her mother's death. Child psychologists would later testify about the profound impact of losing not only her mother but also her trust in law enforcement, the very people she had been taught would protect her. The media coverage continued for weeks, each outlet finding new angles to explore. National newspapers sent reporters to dig into Crawford's history, Destiny's background, looking for signs that everyone had missed. Local coverage focused on the community impact, the divided responses, the calls for police reform. A vigil held for Destiny drew thousands, bringing together unlikely allies, police reform activists, domestic violence survivors, members of law enforcement who recognized the need for change. Lily Crawford attended with her children, a gesture that sparked both criticism and praise. The image of her embracing Destiny's mother, both women united in grief, became a powerful symbol of healing. East Austin's community leaders used the tragedy to push for reforms: better oversight of officer conduct, mandatory psychological evaluations, stricter protocols for handling domestic issues within the force. The department, eager to rebuild trust, implemented changes that would later be known as the Williams Protocols. But for those closest to the tragedy, policy changes and public debates meant little against the weight of their private grief. In the weeks that followed, Lily Crawford would sit in her kitchen late at night, reading and rereading the signs she'd missed, the warnings she'd ignored. Destiny's mother would find herself buying her daughter's favorite coffee creamer, only to remember she'd never need it again. And in 2 homes, separated by Austin's economic and racial divides, 3 children tried to understand why the adults in their lives had failed them so completely. Their grief, their confusion, their anger would ripple through the years ahead, shaping them in ways that would take decades to fully understand. The rain that had fallen during Crawford's final moments became part of the story's mythology. Old-timers would say later that Austin hadn't seen a storm like that since the night of the tragedy. Perhaps it was nature's own commentary, washing away the blood but not the memories, not the consequences, not the hard lessons that some prices are too high to pay for forbidden love. 5 years after the shots that shattered Austin's illusion of racial progress, the conference room at the Austin Police Department headquarters was packed for the unveiling of the Williams-Crawford Reform Act. Lily Crawford sat in the front row, her children now grown, as Chief Wilson detailed the comprehensive changes sparked by that rainy December night. The investigation into James Crawford's final months had revealed systemic failures that could no longer be ignored. Internal Affairs discovered 17 separate instances where fellow officers had noticed concerning behavior but failed to report it. The blue wall of silence had become a wall of enablement, with devastating consequences. The death of Destiny Williams wasn't just a tragedy, the independent investigators' report concluded. It was a preventable failure of institutional oversight and professional responsibility. The report detailed how Crawford's deterioration had been visible to anyone willing to see: increasing alcohol consumption, erratic behavior, unauthorized use of police resources to monitor Destiny's movements. The legal aftermath stretched far beyond criminal investigations. Destiny's mother, now raising Shayla, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the department. The case never made it to trial. The city settled for $4.2 million, accompanied by mandated reforms in departmental policies regarding officer misconduct and mental health monitoring. Lily Crawford faced her own legal battles, fighting to secure her children's inheritance against department attempts to deny Crawford's pension based on his final actions. The case became a landmark in Texas law enforcement policy, forcing departments statewide to reconsider how they handled benefits for officers' families in cases of misconduct. The reforms came in waves. First, immediate policy changes, mandatory psychological evaluations, stricter oversight of officer-witness interactions, clear protocols for reporting concerning behavior. Then, deeper structural reforms, implicit bias training, community oversight boards with real power, and the groundbreaking partner alert system that required officers to report concerning behavior in their colleagues. But the real changes were more personal, more profound. Michael Crawford, once determined to follow his father's path into law enforcement, instead became a civil rights attorney. His first major case involved police accountability reform, bringing him full circle to the issues that had destroyed his family. "My father's badge meant everything to him," he told the Texas Tribune in a rare interview. But he forgot that with that badge comes not just power, but responsibility. The system protected him until it couldn't protect anyone from him. Emma Crawford channeled her anger into activism, creating a support group for children of police officers involved in misconduct. The group expanded nationally, providing a space for young people to grapple with the complex legacy of having a parent whose actions violated their sworn duty. Shayla Williams, Destiny's daughter, grew into a poised young woman who spoke powerfully about domestic violence and police reform. Her annual Destiny's Daughters scholarship program helped children of domestic violence victims attend college, turning personal tragedy into opportunity for others. The Austin Police Department underwent its own transformation. The Williams Protocols became a model for departments nationwide, emphasizing early intervention in officer misconduct and mental health support. The thin blue line remained, but it was redrawn with clear boundaries and accountability measures. Lieutenant Martinez, Crawford's former partner, became a key figure in implementing these changes. "We thought we were protecting him," he admitted during a training session for new officers. "Instead, we were protecting our own comfort at the expense of public safety. That's a mistake we can never make again." The racial dynamics that had complicated the tragedy became a focal point for community healing. East Austin, where Destiny had lived and died, saw increased investment in community policing programs. Officers were required to live in the communities they served, breaking down the barriers between law enforcement and residents. Lily Crawford and Gloria Williams, Destiny's mother, found unexpected common ground in their shared grief. They began appearing together at domestic violence awareness events, their unity a powerful statement about healing across racial and social divides. James and Destiny's story wasn't just about race, or power, or police misconduct. Lily told a silent auditorium at the University of Texas. It was about what happens when we stop seeing each other as human beings, when we let titles and badges and color blind us to our shared humanity. The media narrative evolved over time, moving from sensational headlines to deeper examinations of systemic issues. Documentary filmmakers, academics, and authors explored the intersection of power, race, and accountability that the case represented. The tragedy became a case study in police academy training programs across the country. The Lake Travis Inn, where the affair had blossomed, was eventually demolished for a new development. But locals still called the intersection Crawford's Corner, a reminder that some stories become part of a city's DNA, shaping its growth and evolution. 10 years after the tragedy, Austin had changed in visible and invisible ways. The police department's demographic makeup better reflected the community it served. Oversight committees had real teeth. Mental health support for officers was no longer stigmatized but required. Yet the personal cost remained immeasurable. Holiday dinners at both the Crawford and Williams homes always had empty chairs. Graduation ceremonies, weddings, and birthdays were celebrated with bittersweet awareness of who was missing. Photos of James Crawford were quietly removed from the department's walls, but his story was told to every new recruit as a cautionary tale about power, responsibility, and the thin line between protection and destruction. Shayla Williams, speaking at her high school graduation as valedictorian, perhaps best captured the complex legacy of the tragedy. "My mother's death showed us how systems can fail us. But the response to her death showed us how communities can come together to demand better. She died because good people stayed silent. She is remembered because good people finally spoke up." The final word came from an unexpected source. Officer Rodriguez, now Chief Rodriguez, at his retirement ceremony in 2023, "The badge doesn't make us heroes or villains. It just makes us more of whatever we already are." James Crawford's tragedy wasn't that he failed as a police officer. It's that we failed to notice he had stopped being one long before that final night. Today, a small memorial garden stands outside the East Austin Community Center. The plaque reads simply, "In memory of Destiny Williams." May her story remind us that justice requires more than silence. Every year, on the anniversary of that rainy December night, flowers appear, left by police officers, community members, and family alike. It stands as a testament to how a city's worst moment became the catalyst for its best efforts at change. The story of James Crawford and Destiny Williams became more than a tragedy. It became a turning point, a case study, a catalyst for change. But for those who lived it, who lost parents and children and faith in institutions, it remained painfully personal. Their legacy lives on in changed policies, reformed departments, and most importantly, in the determination that such a failure of system and society